Well, welcome to the Climate Change Committee's advice on the 7th Carbon Budget. This advice builds on over 15 years of analysis, evidence and learning within the committee. I'm Professor Piers Forster. I'm the Interim Chair of the Climate Change Committee and also a climate scientist. I'm going to talk to you about why the budget number we're advising today matters and why it's the Climate Change Committee that gives this advice. All the UK's 10 warmest years have occurred since 2002, from annual record going back to 1884. In 2022, we experienced temperatures of over 40 degrees across large parts of the country. Recent years have frequently seen large areas of the country under water. The UK is already facing the impact of climate change. The Climate Change Act required the country to have a proportional, fair and feasible plan for meeting its legal commitments on climate change. Global ambition, as established under the Paris Agreement, is designed to keep the world well below 2 degrees of warming and make all best efforts to aim for 1.5 degrees. The UK is committed to hitting net zero by 2050. Net zero means that most sources of emissions must be eliminated and that any greenhouse gases that are continuing to be emitted must be balanced by the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. On the way to 2050, the committee is required to advise government on interim carbon budgets. At the most basic level, a carbon budget is a limit on the emissions that are released in the UK over a particular time period. They do break down the long-term problem of climate change into medium-term targets. Each budget is set by the government of the day 12 years ahead of the start of that period. The role of the committee is to provide the government with the best view we can of the right level of each carbon budget, such that Parliament can legislate appropriately and then to offer advice to Parliament and government on delivery. The committee's recommendation is for the government to legislate the 7th carbon budget for the period 2038 to 2042 at 535 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. This represents an 87% reduction in the UK's emissions compared to 1990 levels. When set in legislation, carbon budgets provide certainty to businesses, investors, and households. Confidence in the direction of travel in the UK has driven investments in innovation by businesses in offshore wind, solar power and electric vehicles. we very much welcome the discussion about how the UK should reach its targets. This is just the beginning. The committee is accountable to Parliament, and we look forward to getting representatives from both houses and across the political spectrum to discuss our work. The committee is very proud to give this advice. I now pass to Emma, our Chief Executive, to take you through our work.
Thanks, Piers. Our advice offers a pathway from where we are today to 2050 with comprehensive analysis across each sector of the economy. The pathway also offers the hope of a more prosperous future for people in the UK. In our analysis, both the country and individual households benefit from a low-carbon economy instead of a future where we remain dependent on fossil fuels. This analysis supports the sentiment of UK citizens that has shown up in poll after poll. The British public think that action on climate change is important, and they want the UK to do its fair share to protect nature, our quality of life, and the people that we love from climate change. To realise this better world requires collaboration, investment, and honest discussion across society. There are, of course, trade-offs and uncertainties in our analysis, and the future will continue to surprise us. In 2008, when the Climate Change Act was passed, not many people would have predicted the speed and scale of global offshore wind development as a keystone technology for decarbonising power. In the same way, the committee has sought to offer sensible but nuanced advice on the emerging solutions for areas of the economy which will be critical to decarbonise in 2038, such as for aviation. However, the progress over the recent past means we can be confident about most of the critical action needed by government for the next decade. The UK has made real progress whilst delivering against the carbon budgets to date. The economy has grown while we have been decarbonising rapidly. The emissions reductions during the first 3 carbon budgets were achieved primarily through replacing fossil fuels in our power mix. The UK is the first G7 country to remove coal from the generation mix, a huge achievement. The growth of renewables as a percentage of the electricity mix to 36% is beyond what we could have expected. In transport, the increase in electric vehicle sales and the legislation that enabled it shows the success of government and business working hand in hand. This collaboration between government and business has been vital in delivering emissions reductions to date. Our analysis is the beginning of a discussion, but this report, built on a body of research and real-world experience of the energy transition, shows a future worth delivering. At the heart of the 7th carbon budget is an energy transition which is gathering pace in the UK and internationally. Since the committee last offered advice to government, some technological choices have narrowed into clear market winners. The costs for keystone technologies in power and surface transport have fallen rapidly against fossil fuel equivalents. In particular, the costs of renewables and batteries. The global average cost for new electricity generation has fallen by 88% for solar PV, 60% for wind, and nearly 90% for battery storage since 2010. The committee is confident that generating and using clean electricity across the economy will be doing the heavy lifting on decarbonisation to 2042. Around 60% of the emissions reduction required to meet the 7th carbon budget come from electrification in our pathway. The clean power transition is vital and must go beyond generating this low-carbon energy to deliver a rapid rollout of the technologies that use it. It is also vital to make sure that electricity, the fuel of the future, is cheap. This is a critical assumption in our pathway. This is against the backdrop of a global move towards clean energy technologies, with many of the world's largest economies transitioning at speed. Internationally, the world now invests almost twice as much in clean energy as it does in fossil fuels. The UK's carbon budgets are not delivered in a vacuum. We are aware of the challenging economic situation and the difficulty with the cost of living that many in the UK are struggling with. In recent years, the world has suffered both a pandemic and a gas price crisis. Our analysis delves into the cost of action across the whole economy. This covers the technology costs, the energy costs, the one-off costs, and the timing of deployment, and the levels of demand. Our analysis shows opportunities for the UK economy, from investing in a low-carbon economy, as well as the importance of protecting this economy from the impacts of unmitigated climate change. Over half of the recessions since the 1970s have been caused by a fossil fuel crisis. This country can move beyond our dependence on volatile international fossil fuel markets and security risks that now come with them, which is another important consideration in a less predictable geopolitical age. We also estimate the net costs of net zero will be around 0.2% of UK GDP per year on average. This is lower than in our previous advice. This investment will lead to a net saving to the economy by the time of the 7th carbon budget, with benefits then increasing out to 2050. This saving comes from replacing dirty fossil fuel technologies, which are less efficient at producing and using energy than their modern low-carbon replacements. As in earlier energy transitions, the economy overall will save money from cheaper and more efficiently used energy. The sooner the UK invests in this decade, the sooner we can see the benefits. To realise these benefits, we will need to see a significant level of upfront investment in this Parliament. Most of this investment will come from the private sector, and the role of government will be to provide the market conditions and incentives for people and businesses to deploy their capital, as well as setting policy to meet wider objectives such as industrial strategy or wider social needs. The carbon budgets have helped private sector investment by providing clarity about the UK's future direction, whilst not being so prescriptive that they prevent innovation or new delivery pathways. Investors and technology developers plan investments and projects over decades, not parliaments. Providing understanding of the necessary capital needs to 2042 is a key outcome of legislating this next carbon budget. Our advice for the 7th carbon budget has also considered how people's lives might change through the 2030s. The most meaningful change people can make over the next decade is to replace an old fossil fuel technology for a modern electric equivalent. For example, choosing an electric vehicle when they need to buy a new car, or a new heat pump when they need to replace their gas boiler. A typical UK household will act on climate change but not change their lives radically. They will have a warm home, drive a car, eat a healthy diet, and go on holiday. These choices contribute a third of the emissions reduction in 2040, and over 70% of that is just through heating and transport transitions. The efficiencies and falling costs of these technologies mean that by 2050, a typical household in the UK will save approximately £700 a year on both their energy and on their driving bills. Of course, there are also the upfront costs of new heating systems and cars themselves, and we do offer some advice to government on how these impact different households and how to address these costs where needed. There are also wider benefits for people, such as improved health outcomes through improved air quality and better insulated, warmer homes. Investing in homegrown clean British energy and then using this power in efficient technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps is a more efficient way of using energy across the economy. It significantly protects households from the unpredictable costs of fossil fuel prices by reducing imports. With record numbers of households and business still struggling with their bills, this is further motivation, beyond addressing climate change, to make clean electricity production and electrification as cheap as possible. For the 7th carbon budget, we commissioned a citizens panel to test both the committee's recommendations and wider policy options available to government. The results are in Chapter 8, which is one of my favourite bits of the whole report. The committee strongly believes that thoughtful, honest, informed engagement with the public, which acknowledges competing opinions and trade-offs, is absolutely essential for progress on decarbonisation. The panel showed that the public are keen to understand what they are being asked to do, and they're open to change. They simply want reliable information and a sense that the transition will be fair across society, with government and businesses taking action to make household choices easy, attractive, and affordable for all. The panel reconfirmed, on top of a body of research, how insufficient and confusing the public discussion has been to date about low-carbon technologies and about decarbonisation overall. There has been a lack of clear, independent information available to the public. This must change, and it is another key recommendation in our advice. We provide a full sector breakdown of our pathway in the report, which I hope you'll look at. But there's one new area in our pathway that I really want to highlight, which is our treatment of land use and agricultural emissions. Agriculture is currently the fourth highest emitting sector in the UK economy, and by 2040 it'll be the second highest emitting sector. We need to find a way to deal with these emissions. But in our analysis, we have been able to balance emissions across the agriculture and land use sectors by 2050. What does this mean? Well, in our model, there will still be some emissions from agriculture in 2050, but this is where the net in net zero comes in. Carbon sequestration from woodland expansion and reducing emissions from peatland restoration means that in our pathway, remaining emissions from agriculture are balanced by the carbon dioxide being removed from the atmosphere through better use of land and the restoration and creation of precious natural resources. Farmers and land managers will play a crucial role in delivering this transition. It is really important that their knowledge and skill sets are used. Rural communities and farmers are essential to our future in the UK. We will not tackle climate change without changing how we use our land. But no group has more first-hand experience of how climate change is already impacting us than farmers, with 60% of farmers recently polled saying climate change will have a negative impact on their farm. There's a time pressure on this action for agriculture, land use and nature because there are limits on how fast nature can change. New trees take decades to reach maturity. We need to start ramping up tree planting rates this decade to deliver the carbon removal potential of new woodlands before 2050. Rural communities have always adapted to the needs of the populations that depend on them. But farmers and land managers need government support, sustainable livelihoods and a plan for what they need to do. At a challenging time, decarbonisation is something we know how to do, which offers opportunities for the economy and chances to improve people's lives. Humans have created the problem of climate change, but now we have the means to fix it. The committee is also asked to make recommendations on how government might act to deliver the carbon budgets. We have grouped our suggestions for this carbon budget to government into 7 buckets. Make electricity cheaper. This is vital to enable a switch to efficient, low-carbon electric technologies across many sectors. Remove planning barriers. To reduce energy bills and improve our energy security, the UK's grid infrastructure needs improving, and the processes that can enable this need to speed up. Provide certainty. Timely decisions on new technologies and phase-out dates provides confidence to investors, businesses and the public on what needs to happen next. Support households to install low-carbon heating, especially low-income households. And support businesses to decarbonise. UK businesses could take advantage of growing global demand for low-carbon goods and services. Grow the necessary workforces. Government, working with businesses, workers and communities, should proactively plan for how to enable this. And engage with the public. A strategy is needed that engages the public about the benefits of low-carbon choices with clear and trusted information. Now, to take you through how we came to these recommendations, here is Dr. Emily Nurse, our head of Net Zero.
Thanks, Emma. I'm now going to talk you through some of the detail of the analysis that underpins our advice on the 7th carbon budget. I'll start with a look back on the UK's progress so far. This chart shows how greenhouse gas emissions have fallen in the UK in the last 3 decades. Since 1990, emissions have approximately halved, and the pace of emissions reduction has more than doubled since the UK's Climate Change Act and carbon budgets were introduced 17 years ago. The first 3 of the UK's carbon budgets, these orange blocks, have all been achieved. The reported emissions, shown by the grey line, are lower than each of the budgets. In the next 25 years, the UK needs to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The seventh carbon budget starts in 13 years, covering the period 2038 to 2042. To advise on an ambitious and deliverable level for this budget, we've produced what we call our balanced pathway. This is an emissions reduction pathway for the UK, starting from this year, 2025, taking us to net zero emissions by 2050. Achieving this pathway would ensure that the UK stops contributing to global warming. Our balanced pathway meets all of the UK's existing targets. These are the next 3 carbon budgets shown as pinkish blocks. And the UK's international targets, the nationally determined contributions, shown as black bars. Our advised 7th carbon budget is shown as the last bright purple block. As you can see, it's a lot smaller than the other blocks. As Piers has said, it's a limit of 535 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Setting this budget would mean that the UK's emissions over the 5-year period from 2038 to 2042 should not exceed this amount. That's an 87% reduction in emissions from levels in 1990. If this budget is achieved, emissions will be around a quarter of today's levels in 2040, the middle of the 7th carbon budget period. Importantly, our analysis has shown that not only is this emissions reduction deliverable, it will bring additional benefits such as cleaner air, lower energy bills, and improved energy security. As Emma has mentioned, over half of the emissions reductions seen over the first 3 carbon budget periods were in the energy supply sectors, shown in yellow here. Looking forwards, action needs to broaden to all other sectors of the economy. Emma discussed the role of transport and heating buildings. Here you can see that around half the emissions reduction needed to achieve the 7th carbon budget comes from surface transport, shown in bright purple, and in buildings, shown in orange. Contributions from aviation, agriculture, carbon sequestration from trees and other land use, and from engineered removals also become increasingly important. This is especially true in the last stretch to net zero after the 7th carbon budget period. Now let's look in more detail at these future emissions reductions. Underpinning our balanced pathway is a set of sectoral pathways showing how emissions are projected to fall in each sector of the economy over the next 25 years. The UK's highest emitting sector is surface transport, which is currently responsible for around a quarter of the UK's emissions. This is mostly emissions from petrol and diesel cars, vans and lorries. In our pathway, these emissions fall rapidly as electric vehicles powered by clean electricity replace them. The physics of electric cars makes them good, efficient technologies, typically with lower running and maintenance costs than petrol and diesel cars. In the next few years, we also expect them to be cheaper to buy. For second-hand cars, this is already the case. By 2040, surface transport emissions fall by 86% in our pathway compared to today. The UK's next highest emitting sector is residential buildings. This is mostly emissions from gas and oil boilers used to heat our homes. In our pathway, these boilers are replaced by low-carbon electric technologies, mostly heat pumps. This happens in our pathway when it's time for households to replace their heating system. Heat pumps are also very efficient technologies, generally 3 to 4 times as efficient as a gas boiler. Our pathway sees a rapid increase in installation rates similar to those seen in other countries, such as the Netherlands and Ireland. By 2040, emissions will have fallen by around 2/3 in this sector, putting it well on the way to almost completely decarbonising by 2050. As Emma has said, switching to an electric vehicle and an electric heat pump when it's time to buy a car or change your boiler are the 2 most significant changes individuals can make to reduce the UK's emissions. Emissions from industry fall 78% by 2040. This is achieved predominantly by electric technologies replacing fossil fuel ones. There's also a role for hydrogen in industry and for carbon capture and storage technologies, which capture carbon dioxide emissions from industrial activity and transport it to permanent geological storage. Supporting decarbonisation is important for UK industries so they can benefit from the increasing global demand for low-carbon goods. The electrification of vehicles, heating systems and industry is supported by the decarbonisation and expansion of the electricity supply system. In 1990, electricity supply was the UK's highest emitting sector. Emissions have since fallen by 81%, and by 2040 will be a further 88% lower than today in our pathway. This is driven by a rapid expansion of the already significant renewable electricity generation in the UK. Our pathway has a backbone of offshore wind and significant contributions from onshore wind and solar. Supporting this, there's a portfolio of other types of generation and storage to ensure the UK gets enough electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. I can assure you that we have considered that possibility. Emissions in agriculture and aviation already contribute significantly to the UK's total. By the 7th carbon budget period, they will be the largest emitting sectors, together contributing more than half of the UK's emissions. Emissions reductions are slower in these sectors as no clear technological solutions to completely eliminate their emissions exist. A combination of lower carbon technologies and practices and measures to manage demand are particularly important in these sectors. The balanced pathway also sees reductions in emissions from fuel supply, waste, commercial and public buildings, shipping and F-gases. By the 7th carbon budget period, our pathway includes removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Around a third of the UK's residual emissions will be balanced by negative emissions. The land use sector will be a net sink by this time, getting increasingly negative by 2050. Engineered removals from both bioenergy and carbon capture and storage and from direct air capture of carbon dioxide will also be being deployed at scale. Overall, the makeup of emissions in 2040 will be very different to today. Let's look now at the balance of emissions in 2050. Whilst most sectors will be almost completely decarbonised, emissions will remain in some, particularly aviation and agriculture. These emissions must be balanced by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, such that the UK is at net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Emma already explained how emissions from agriculture in our pathway are balanced by the natural sequestration of carbon dioxide, that's mostly from planting more trees. Together, the agriculture and land sectors reach net zero emissions by 2050. Residual emissions from the other sectors are balanced by engineered removals. In these technologies, carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere is permanently stored. In our analysis, the aviation sector is assumed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, with any residual emissions from flying offset by engineered removals. We assume that the aviation industry pays for these removals. So what does the UK need to do to achieve the 7th carbon budget? The dashed line in this chart shows a projection of emissions in the absence of any new action to reduce emissions. Emissions are projected to be similar to levels today, slightly increasing as population and GDP are projected to grow. We call this the baseline. This purple line shows our balanced pathway, which shows emissions falling over the next 25 years to reach net zero by 2050. The emissions reductions in the balanced pathway can be grouped into 5 key routes that branch across the different sectors of economy that I've just discussed. First, the purple wedges show reductions in high carbon activities. For example, reducing the energy wasted when heating our homes by installing insulation. Other examples include reducing livestock farming with a switch from some of the meat and dairy that people eat for low carbon and healthier food, and increasing the use of public transport, walking and cycling. While we see an increase in flying from today's levels, this increase is lower than in the baseline. Second, the yellow and orange wedges make up the biggest chunk by far. As Emma has said, 60% of the emissions reduction required to meet the 7th carbon budget comes from switching from fossil fuel technologies to more efficient electric technologies. This is mostly electric vehicles and heat pumps, as well as various electric industrial technologies. This is all underpinned by an expanded and decarbonised electricity supply system. There are some technologies that cannot be electrified. For these, the third group, the red one, shows a role for low-carbon fuels. These include sustainable aviation and shipping fuels and hydrogen. There is also a role for carbon capture and storage, which can be used, for example, to capture the process emissions in activities such as cement production. Fourth, nature-based measures play an important role in our pathway, as shown by the green group here. Trees are planted on land freed up by a reduction in the numbers of cattle and sheep. Our pathway sees an increase in the proportion of the UK's land that is covered in woodland from around 13% today to 19% by 2050, and much of the UK's peatland is restored. These benefits will increase beyond 2050. And lastly, in black, engineered removals play a crucial role in balancing emissions that cannot feasibly be eliminated. Emma talked about how technology choices have become clearer and markets have scaled up rapidly in recent years. Where that hasn't happened, we encourage the government and industry to develop multiple options until there's a clear technological solution. Our pathway relies on the rollout of these low-carbon technologies. Renewable energy generation has already entered the mass market stage in the UK, driving much of the successful decarbonisation of electricity supplies so far. This will continue to increase rapidly as the UK continues to decarbonise and expand electricity generation. Electric cars are in the early adoption stage, with 3% of cars on the UK's roads fully electric. Sales are increasing fast, and as I said earlier, we're expecting new electric vehicles to be as cheap as petrol cars to buy in the next few years. At this point, sales should accelerate rapidly, and by 2040, 80% of cars on the road are electric in our pathway. Heat pumps are currently installed in only around 1% of homes in the UK, but in almost all other European countries there are many more. These are good and well-established technologies and should lead to lower energy bills for households. By 2040, around half of the UK's current homes will be heated with a heat pump, and some with other forms of electric heat. Some technologies, such as synthetic fuels for aviation and shipping, are in the innovation phase. Investment is needed to ensure they can be deployed and scaled up as soon as possible. The transition to net zero is predominantly a technological transition. Such transitions have happened rapidly before, and being at the forefront of these can provide advantages to the UK. We've already transitioned away from coal. The next stage is to transition from oil and gas. Demand for oil and gas will fall significantly by 2050 as the UK moves to a homegrown electrified energy system. This will allow the UK to avoid having to import significant amounts of oil and gas in the future. Overall, energy imports will be less than a quarter of levels today by 2050 in our pathway. This will provide better energy security and shield household bills from global energy price shocks, such as those we've seen in recent years. So, in conclusion, our recommended 7th carbon budget is an ambitious yet deliverable target. Achieving it would put the UK well on track to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and ending its contribution to global warming.
Today is the beginning of the 7th carbon budget's journey. The government has over a year to propose their 7th carbon budget, which will be voted on in Parliament. We look forward to this and stand ready to support in any way we can with that process. Before that, we will be offering carbon budget advice to the Northern Ireland Executive and the Welsh and Scottish governments. These add up to form part of the 7th carbon budget, but we have separate analysis for each part of the country. We will be visiting those nations to offer this advice, and I look forward to working with each of the devolved nations this year. Finally, I want to take a moment to address the reality that we're all living with. The climate is already changing, and the impacts of that are being felt here in the UK. People notice the world is changing around them. They notice how their neighbourhoods or local landscapes are impacted at times of extreme heat, months of rain, or floods. We are a population of people that has always thought of our green and pleasant landscapes, our gently changing seasons, and we have fought to protect them. We are a nation that gets furious when commuter trains are cancelled for leaves on the line, let alone when rails buckle under heat or disappear under floods. We worry when our precious National Health Service and vulnerable loved ones are impacted by increased hospital admissions from heat waves or cold snaps. We care when food in our shops is more expensive or when our farmers lose an entire crop to extreme weather. Adapting to a changing world is also essential, and the Adaptation Committee will be offering their advice on this in 2026. But let us never forget, as some do, that not doing anything on climate change is putting at risk things that are precious to the UK and part of our national identity. Doing nothing is costly, not cost-free. Looking into the future, we see genuine hope and opportunity for the UK. Working for the committee means working with some of the most brilliant minds in the country, debating ideas, and doing our best to offer a transparent and honest view about how the government might deliver a decarbonised future. There is no doubt that a safer, cleaner, better world is possible. This is not some fanciful wish, but a considered position based completely on economic realities and scientific models. Thank you to all of those who've provided support and evidence for our work. It is as strong as it is because of all of you. Now it's down to government to decide what to do with our advice, debate and legislate a target in Parliament, and produce their own pathway and policies for delivery.